Welcome back, everybody, to Neutrality Studies. Today, again, with Professor Radhika Desai, who recently started her own YouTube channel on which she is interviewing a lot of very interesting people and doing very good work under Radhika Desai, geopolitical economist. Please do look it up, but only after our discussion here. Radhika, welcome back.
Great to be back, Pascal. Thank you so much. And thanks for helping promote my new YouTube channel.
Anytime. I love your discussions and I love your take that you're doing, because
Thank
you're
you.
coming at it from, of course, an economist, kind of a Marxist economist view, and you have a lot of very good discussions on there. So it's very much recommended. And we today just wanted to actually talk a little bit about what happened this week. We're talking on April 3rd, Friday. Good Friday. Happy Good Friday. And the week was weird, especially because Donald Trump gave a very weird speech in which I actually kind of expected him to announce victory and just leave. But I think that's not actually what's on the cards. Can you give us a little bit your interpretation of this Trump speech earlier this week?
Well, I think that Trump basically gave what I call a word salad of a speech, his usual, peppered with bombastic boasts and superlatives and self congratulation and self contradiction and delusion and everything in between. But basically, I think that it's very interesting. So I agree with you. I also expected that that he would announce some kind of pause, but of course he can't announce a pause or an end to the war, because in order to announce an end to the war, he has to come out of it with something that looks like victory, that he can at least paint as a victory, even if it has to put a lot of lipstick on that pig. It has to ultimately look like victory, and he doesn't have that. And and what's really interesting, and to understand why that's the case, you have to understand that this, people say this is a war of choice, and in one sense, of course, it's a war of choice insofar as it's a war. But in another respect, I think that Trump's options were narrowing. Options for what? Options for what he can do in order to shore up his dismally sinking approval ratings. Over the past year, having been elected on promises that he has neither the intention nor the ability to keep, he hasn't made the world better. He hasn't made America great again. He hasn't made the ordinary working class person's life better. He hasn't increased jobs. He hasn't increased pay. He hasn't increased manufacturing, because all of this would require him to restrict the options and choices of the very class, namely the topmost corporate capitalist class that he intends to serve. Anyway, that's why he got elected. So these two things are going apart. And so he now, with the Venezuela misadventures, with all the crazy statements about Greenland and what have you, what he has been trying to secure is some kind of military victory. And so, given he was already desperate to find something he can call a victory, he was very susceptible to Netanyahu's claims that somehow, if you start a war on Iran, within a weekend it will be over. The people in Tehran will rise up. They will take over the government. End of day, you can declare a victory. See, I've solved a problem that, half a dozen of the previous presidents have not been able to solve, etc., etc. But this has not happened. Netanyahu, of course, has his own reasons for delusion. His political position is also extremely precarious. He needs a war as well. So anyway, so Trump did not get it. So essentially, it was full of self-contradiction. So on the one hand, we have won. On the other hand, we have to still, make sure that Iran does not have nuclear weapons and, whatever, change the government, etc. So, I mean, on the one hand, he's going to negotiate with the new government, which is, more sensible and what have you. On the other hand, he's threatening to rain destruction on the energy infrastructure and so on. So it is a completely incoherent speech. And the only thing it tells you is that the United States has sunk into the mother of all Middle Eastern quagmires. That's what the Trump administration, having been elected on a promise of not starting new wars, has landed the United States in. That's what we heard, yes, Thursday evening. Yeah.
Yeah, and of course,
Or Wednesday. Yeah.
of course, like basically leaving the Middle East at this point Why it's probably a little bit also naive from our point to just think that Trump could actually retreat is that it would mean that he would have to take all of the Americans out of the Middle East. He would have to abandon all of the military bases in Kuwait, in Bahrain, in Abu Dhabi, and so on. Completely abandon them, right, and abandon them for good. And that is we're still a long way off from that. Even if the troops have been withdrawn to a good part, but then actually say like, okay, fine, we're probably not gonna come back, would be a whole different level. And even then, Iran said, "Look, we're not going to stop firing." I mean, even if your people are gone, until and unless we say it's enough, our missiles are going to keep flying to Israel. So, in a sense, it's not up to Trump anymore whether the war ends or not. And the Iranians, they are very adamant about this. This war will end when we say it ends. And so far, I think that's not just rhetoric. They believe in that, and they say like, we will make sure that the Americans don't come back. And they pay reparations. But where do you think that? Do you think that it's already outside the control of Donald Trump at this point?
Oh, completely. I think that, and that's partly what a quagmire means, is that you are no longer in control of your situation. It's like you are sinking in quicksand, and you can't, you're not in control. So absolutely. And I would say that, to me, it's really interesting that, of the United States, in the case of Ukraine, fought Russia through a proxy. It has not yet started a war with China. I mean, apart from the economic war, the sanctions war, and so on. But Iran, it's very interesting that Russia today, China today, and Iran today are all, in an important sense, products of their revolutionary societies. Russia is no longer Soviet Russia, but still, in many ways, its traditions, its understanding of the world, etc., come from that past, which still have imparted to it a lot of strengths. So I think that of these three, the first, the United States has engaged in direct war with the first of these, which is Iran. And I think that it is very interesting that it is going to come out of it looking extremely bad, essentially, because, the United States is not in control of when it can leave. The United States bases in the region have been badly affected. Its ability to surveil, its ability to monitor what's going on has been radically depleted by Iranian missile strikes, etc., in the region. So it's almost as if they're fighting cyclists. From what I understand, its two big aircraft carriers that it had brought into the region have been damaged, and they have had to withdraw.
Hey, very brief intermission because I was recently banned from YouTube. And although I'm back, this can happen anytime again. So please consider subscribing not only here, but to my mailing list on Substack. That's pascalotta.substack.com. The link's going to be in the description below. And now back to the video.
Plus, this is also doing damage to the Atlantic Alliance, to NATO, because the European countries, which are dependent on the oil that comes from there and in general are experiencing an enormous oil crisis. And I know that, they are still trying desperately to hold on to the NATO alliance, but the best will in the world is not going to allow them to overlook the enormous oil crisis in which the United States is putting all allies. Plus, you can look at the Gulf, the GCC countries, the Persian Gulf countries. They are all beginning to realize that it is more difficult. Or let me rephrase that, the so-called advantages of the US security umbrella have been flipped into disadvantages because their very raison d'etre has been affected. They have offered the world, or, the rich people of the world, with the security to come there, do business, to frolic and enjoy their leisure activities. And now, with the attacks on the very hotels in which US troops are being housed and so on, I think that this business model is being undermined. So in all of these ways, the United States is losing. And so, at one level, I feel that we are looking at, I have been talking about the decline of US power for a long time. I've also said that, US power wasn't, the United States was never hegemonic in any serious sense, in any stable sense. But nevertheless, it had more power once, and that power is now declining. And we are looking now at an acceleration of that decline of that power. Because if the United States is expelled from the region, this is going to be momentous. The United States has been, involved up to its neck in the region since for a century now. And its expulsion from that region will, and I think that this is what Iran will need. Iran cannot have the United States remaining there. There's another, one final point maybe I'll make for now, and that is whether it is Iran or whether it is Europe or the Gulf countries or Japan for that matter, whatever, all of these allies, why should they trust the United States? I mean, no, it's not only that the United States has attacked Iran twice while in the midst of negotiations under Trump. But, I was very intrigued that Martin Wolf, who's normally, I mean, he says many interesting things, but obviously I don't agree with everything he says. And I certainly know that he is an Atlanticist if there ever was one. And he said in a recent column that the United States is no longer a reliable partner because any country that can elect a man like Trump twice is not to be trusted. Now, this is a huge breach. I mean, if people like him are thinking like this, it's a huge breach. So really, in terms, and we haven't even talked about the economy, but the economic reverberations of all this, and then add to that these political reverberations, these diplomatic reverberations, and I think US power is now plummeting.
Yeah, it's quite interesting. I mean, you're the second person today who's making exactly that point to me. The first one was Saul Takahashi, a Japanese American human rights lawyer, who said like who was actually in Abu Dhabi just recently when the war started, and was like, yeah, the UAE and so on. They were gambling on this, right? This is security because the Americans are there, and now it's just like no, the U.S. bases are are nothing that keeps you secure. They are missile magnets. They are the reason why you're getting attacked. And even though they are blaming, of course, Iran for this, a lot of people understand. Look, this is a problem. This is a failed security strategy on our part just as much as it is a product of the U.S. Iranian confrontation, right? That illegal war of aggression. But this is leading to a rethinking. So also in Japan, right, where people just understand, even if they think that this is ultimately the fault of Iran. The point that is also coming across. I mean, if the United States cannot protect the UAE and Kuwait from Iran, how the hell are they going to protect Japan from China? I mean, that kind of realization is now out in the open, and at the moment, the interesting feature, of course, of the war, the U.S.-Israel-Iran war, is that it's not an asymmetric war. It's not Afghanistan. It's not Iraq. It's not in this insurgent warfare. It's not guerrilla warfare. No, Iran is standing its ground, and although Iran cannot attack the U.S. motherland, it can do everything short of that to hurt the U.S. In the region, and trying to hurt them economically. And they're doing that, even though it has downstream consequences also for them. So seems like this is a different animal to tackle also for the US.
Yes, I mean, I think that, like I said, the fact that they're a revolutionary society makes a
Yeah.
big difference. The commitment, because you see, when I say revolutionary, they're anti-imperialist societies. It's funny because so much of the commentary in the press is about how the globalized world is in retreat, globalization is in retreat. But actually, globalization was always a euphemism for imperialism.
Yep.
Imperialism is in retreat. That's what we have to recognize. And ultimately, what was imperialism about? Imperialism was about getting inputs, food, etc., cheaply from the rest of the world. I was chatting with a young man here in London who works for a energy company, alternative energy company, and he was complaining about how with the Iran war should be a big boom for alternative energy company in the UK, but the government is not really taking the right steps and so on. And I said, at the end of the day, you have to realize that countries like the UK would far prefer to get cheap oil than to invest in alternative energy, because the alternative energy infrastructure has to be built here. When you get cheap oil, you're getting cheap oil on the backs of people working elsewhere. That is to say, it's an imperial relationship, whereas instead of manufacturing it locally. But anyway, the point is that this is an imperial set of relationships. The Western world rests on a supply of cheap oil, cheap food, cheap inputs of all sorts, and so on. And that is what is now being stopped. And by the way, the same thing, there's a reason why we are talking about the 1970s again, in terms of the economic effects. People are saying basically, I forget who it is, but some important agency has said that this is the biggest energy shock ever in the world, and or compared at least to the 1970s energy shock. And there's a reason, because at that time also, what created the energy shock, and more generally a wider commodity shock, is the demand of third world countries for a new international economic order and everything that went. The OPEC oil shock was just the sharpest edge of that wedge, so to speak. And so we are sort of in one sense back there, and that's why I underline, because the revolutionary character of these societies is that Iran is fundamentally anti-imperialist. Why? Because they saw from a position where they had never been colonized as such, but nevertheless they saw that imperialism will try to manipulate. They arranged the coup against Mossadegh, etc., precisely because Mossadegh was acting in the national interest, trying to say,
The oil is ours.
nationalization of oil, etc., etc. So anyway, so to make a long story short, yes, and I think that this is why the US is getting its comeuppance. Absolutely, it's completely different.
But in a sense, you could argue that the United States too is, of course, the child of a revolution. I mean, they're celebrating 250 years of United States, of the Constitution, and so on, right? 1776. In the narrative, the United States is, of course,
Yes.
the modern United States is a child of opposing the Brits, right, and the Boston Tea Party, and getting rid of the shackles. But it's kind of a very different form of revolution, wasn't it?
Well, that's where my Marxist thinking will come in, because there are revolutions and there are revolutions. The American Revolution was a bourgeois revolution. It was a revolution of which created a state which ultimately became not only which was a white settler state based on the elimination of the indigenous population, based on slaving, etc., etc. So all of that was part of it, and ultimately it established a capitalist society, and I would argue that capitalist societies must necessarily be imperialist. And the United States' problem has been that once it completed its process of internal colonization, which extended the territory of the United States to what it is today, the moment they did that also coincided with the moment when the rest of the world had more or less finished, the rest of the capitalist powers of the world had more or less finished dividing up the world amongst themselves. So the United States was left with very little formal empire. So it then kind of came up with this more ephemeral conception of empire, where essentially it was going to compel the governments of the world to open their economies. Remember the open door policy and so on. People talk about Monroe Doctrine, but I think the open door policy is more important, because ultimately the Monroe Doctrine was originally proclaimed in order to keep Europe out of the Americas.
Yep.
In common with the interests of all the Americas, not to dominate the rest of Americas, but we'll leave that aside. But, that the whole world should open up to American trade and American corporations and what have you. And this has been a losing battle. Within a couple of decades, you had the Bolshevik Revolution. Eventually, you had the Chinese Revolution. For bulk of the 20th century, an entire landmass and the populations that existed between roughly Prague and Pyongyang were under a completely different dispensation, which the United States could not penetrate. And just when the Soviet Union collapsed, that was unfortunately a Pyrrhic victory, because by that time, the United States had already entered into its neoliberal phase, which has brought it to its current impasse, because you can't keep transferring income and wealth from ordinary people towards a tiny elite, which is essentially what neoliberalism has and financialization have done. You can't keep doing that and expect social stability to survive. I mean, you have created a society which is today more unequal than the so-called Gilded Age of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. So in this context, social division, economic inequality has created social division. Social division has led to political problems, in the sense that no party has been able to win elections in a convincing way. And the only way Trump could win elections is by doing the one thing that other parties, the establishment of other parties, were not able to do or not willing to do, which is to tell the American people there's something seriously wrong with their economy. And he told them that. He got elected, but of course he has no intention of resolving it. So he's now in the current problem that he's in. So all of this is, I mean, think about it. All of this is the internal problems of a US society, neoliberal, financialized US society in decline, ensnaring the rest of the world in the problems. Because basically, when a big beast is dying and it is sort of, in its death throes, then these death throes will affect the rest of the world. And that's what we are looking at right now.
It's just also so fascinating, right? That early stage capitalism actually industrialized the country when the economic output of the capitalist elite was based on the exploitation of the local population, right? Then you industrialize the country, which actually helps your entire foreign policy spiel. And then once your revenue model, the capitalist revenue model, starts depending upon just being a parasite on foreign working population, then you deindustrialize the country and you financialize, and then you actually lose the basis upon which your previous power base was built upon. And yes, the United States still has lovely aircraft carriers, which by now don't really matter very much anymore. And apparently there's even a lack of the ability to produce stuff because that has been shipped abroad so much. It's quite fascinating. So I mean, the late victory of Marx, when he said, like, they're going to sell us the rope on which we're going to hang them. That wasn't Marx, that was Lenin. But
Well, I'll make one tiny correction to what you said, which is that, the industrialization of the United States cannot be separated from imperialism. This idea that somehow the United States industrialized on its own steam, and then, isn't it puzzling why it's now become such an imperialist power? No, the United States was able to industrialize, as was continental Europe, as were the offshoots of Britain, Canada, Australia, etc. All of these for all of these countries, the late 19th and early 20th centuries were the period of their fastest industrialization. And this was made possible precisely because under the gold standard regime, under the sterling standard, essentially what was happening is that Britain in particular was extracting surpluses from its non-settler colonies, like India, like colonies in Africa and the Caribbean and so on. So you extract surpluses from your non-settler colonies. And then because you are a small economy, you can only absorb so much. And also your banking structures are happier exporting capital than investing it at home. So because the British economy began deindustrializing in the same period, roughly 1870 to 1914, and still deindustrializing. This surplus was exported as capital exports to where? To the United States preeminently, and North America more generally, in the United States, Canada, continental Europe, and then the other offshoots of the US, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, etc. So in that sense, the imperialism should not just be considered as a relationship between one mother country and its colonies, but rather an imperial system in which people are differentially located. So even without colonies, countries like the United States, without substantial colonies, still benefited from the existence of an imperial system. And towards the end of this period, seeing that the United Kingdom was becoming weaker, sought to then replace the United Kingdom as a sort of leading element in this imperial system. And of course, and then of course there is all the history of U.S. investment abroad, and then of course the financialization and the dollar system and so on, which we can go into. But the point is that the U.S. was always part of the imperial system, and then from that it emerged to take a leading part, but at a time when the whole imperial system was already had entered its declining phase, which to me begins at 1914. 1914 is the peak. Since then, we have seen a decline of imperial power. It's just not as fast as you and I might like to see it. So,
Yeah, but it seems to me that this is we are reaching this impasse, right? Where even the neocolonialism of the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and the whole globalization of the then into the 2000s, it just doesn't fly anymore. Yesterday I republished an article by Dr. Darini Rajasinghams and Ananyake, who wrote a really lovely piece saying, like, look, the Sri Lanka, of all places, just now saw what the United States is willing to do by sinking an Iranian unarmed vessel right in front of their shores, even then not even rescuing the survivors, and the Sri Lanka rushing to survive to rescue whoever was still floating in there. Plus, the entire economic, the ecological disaster of all the oil that went out, and this wreckage now down there, that a good part of the coast is now basically poisoned, and the United States just goes like, ha ha ha, look what we could do, ha ha. And she wrote like, this is time for them to go. It's like time. I mean, United States must, and not just the U.S., Britain as well, and France as well, right? I mean, they need to pack up, and this kind of voices, they're gonna get louder and louder now, aren't they? Do you perceive them also like in the rest of
yes,
Asia?
I think that, one of the expressions I've been using is that the United States and the West more generally is basically out of carrots in terms of like organizing its imperial system, enticing countries to sort of be so happily subordinated to itself. It can't do that anymore. So now they are resorting more and more to sticks. But now those sticks themselves are getting completely, how can you say, chaotic. They don't seem to have any goal because these sticks are unable to achieve any real goal. So they are now being used, like imagine instead of using your gun to kill an enemy, you are using it to terrorize people just because, since you can't kill the enemy anyway, you might as well use it for something. And that's the sort of irresponsible activity, as you rightly point out, that you saw off the coast of Sri Lanka, that you are seeing now. And of course, this is just going to make the imperial powers, I mean, there's nothing attractive about them anymore. And nor are they even to be feared. They're just to be like, like, stop already. Like, this does not make sense. You are not, we will do everything in our power not to have you. I mean, take for example what happened in Venezuela. We are invited to see it as a great victory of American military and imperial power. But in reality, they have, even for poor, weak Venezuela, which has been weakened for so many decades under American sanctions and so on, they were not able to achieve any kind of regime change. The Delcy Rodriguez became the whatever acting president that she is, entirely constitutionally, and the United States must deal with her because it does not have the capacity to take over Venezuela. It does not have a single person it can appoint as a governor there who will actually be able to keep control and be able to get what it wants. So this gives Delcy Rodriguez also at least some, even though the United States may be sequestering the oil revenues in a bank in Qatar or whatever it may be, she can still state her terms because they need her as much as, she has been made dependent on them, especially with the kidnapping of Maduro and so on.
Yeah, I mean the great brutality is not a sign of strength, right? It's a sign of like things going really south, and the big stick being the last thing that you've got left. And in a sense, this is this is the point that it's apparently the United States now has reached. Also, like with making it obvious that it's not anymore about offering, good terms or better life or freedom or prosperity or what. No, that's what they are actively trying to prevent others from achieving. Even saying so out loud. I mean, one of the goals is to make sure China doesn't get even richer, right? And other nations can't get richer. So it's like the whole the whole kind of soft power thing is gone. So, and that's probably not going to come back anytime soon.
Totally.
Mm.
And as far as sorry, please repeat that.
The soft power thing, it's not going to come back.
No, absolutely not. I think, in fact, this began to change even a little bit earlier, during the pandemic. I think, with all the vaccine apartheid and so on, I think that people around the world began to see what the West really was. All this talk about how much we want your development, etc. But of course, the moment a country actually develops, as China has, it instantly becomes an enemy.
Yeah.
So in that sense, I think the people began to see, all that toppling of statues that was going on in Western countries also made people realize that there's something, more around the world that there is it's astonishing how much anti-imperialism there is and how much it pervades the political spectrum across the world. I mean, there are today on the YouTube, for example, lots of people who are willing to talk about against imperialism, although they don't quite connect it to capitalism, so that they seem to be kind of often quite right-wing in capitalist terms, but they are willing to be critical of imperialism, of imperial actions, and so on and so forth. So I think that was certainly so. It has been going on for a while, and I think that absolutely, I think that in most third world countries, whether you're talking about India, Africa, the Caribbean, etc., um, the hypocrisy, the incompetence, the powerlessness, the productive decline of the Western world, etc. All of this is now on full display, and I think that so people, the perception is there. Now it's just a question of how, I mean, take India for example. I think we have a government in India which is still trying to kowtow to the United States, to getting closer to Israel, etc. But that position is not, and that's probably what the corporate elite of India want. But more widely in India, I would say that position has less and less legitimacy.
Right. So it's actually going. There's going to be the moment when in other countries, the like being a close ally to the United States will become a serious liability, right? We are seeing it even in Europe, like how the opposition parties are starting to frame themselves in terms of opposition to U.S. dictates.
Exactly.
They're still a minority, but um,
I mean, take for example in Canada and Australia, the parties and candidates who were aligning themselves with Trump got a real drubbing after Trump took office and he started talking about, Canada as the 51st state and what have you. And I think that this is beginning to happen. Like, Nigel Farage in the UK is having to distance himself from Trump. So do other right-wing forces. So in a certain sense, I think being anti-Trump is, becoming de rigueur for politicians in most of the rest of the world.
Yeah, because of course, like Donald Trump, I mean, the one thing that he had going for himself during the election that I thought was not bad is that he had a very he displayed a very principled anti warmongering stance, right? That was his whole spiel, and all of that is out, all of it
Yes.
completely gone. I mean, burned on the altar of well, whatever Israel is, kind of okay, and up in flames, right? With Ukraine, he could at least still say like, yeah, I couldn't achieve peace, but it wasn't my war. Well, now that's completely out, right?
Yes.
So it's kind of sad though, and it's just proving again that it doesn't really matter who the American population votes for. At the end, they always get Dick Cheney, right? It's
Yeah. This is really interesting. I was talking to KJ No on a show on my own channel just yesterday, and he said that he had been to one of these No Kings protests. And I thought, I was just expressing the hope that perhaps these protests will bring forth the political force that the United States really needs, which is a force that accepts that the United States has tried to be imperialist in the past. It has failed miserably. The cost has been paid by the people of the United States, because these attempts at imposing US will and power around the world have been central to the deindustrialization of the United States, the decline in the productive power of the economy, the financialization, the inequality. All of these things have been tied up with this dollar system and the militarization of US society and so on. So you need a force that's to say, look, plan A, which was like world domination, is not working. We've had this plan since the early 20th century. It's not working. It's never worked. We need plan B. Plan B is that the United States should realize that it is a big productive economy, but it is one among many, that its future lies in having cooperative relations with the rest of the world, and that this is what we are going to do. We're not going to fight with them. Earlier you were talking about Japan and China and Europe and Russia. I mean, the best way they can increase their security is to have good relations.
Yeah.
Japan with China and Western Europe with Russia. I mean, how else, yeah. Anyway, so to come back to Trump, I mean, you need that force to arise. And I was expressing the hope that perhaps these, No Kings protests, these elections of people like Zohran Mamdani, perhaps herald the emergence of the new phase. And KJ said, look, yeah, it would be very good, but I didn't see it happening. I went to some of these protests, and all the pro-peace voices were systematically suppressed. You were not to criticize the war.
Really?
Go figure.
Really? At the No
Go
Kings
figure.
protest?
So it was like anti-Trump, because Trump
Ah.
is behaving in an eccentric way, in an unpredictable way. Because remember, Trump has been doing all of these
Well,
horrible things domestically as well. These ICE raids, these crazy
right.
tariffs, etc. So the war on America's institutions, whether it's the Federal Reserve or other important offices, all of these are, of course, go up people's nose. So, but it is interesting that. So, to me, I think that the United States is still a long way.
Yeah.
But I think that the moment such a force emerges, I think the United States will become what it should be, a valued part of the international community. But until people in the United States, I mean, basically what I'm saying, and I think I'm not originally saying this, if there is regime change needed anywhere, it's in the United States, basically.
Yeah, and in a sense, I mean, China and Russia and the others, they're all signaling that the one thing they would like to is have good relationship with the United States, right? And be on the good side. Can we not just be how we are and be friends with you? Do we have to be the significant other? I was having this discussion also with Aaron Good, who wrote a beautiful book actually about the way the United States political system works, and his greatest criticism also on all of the political
I think
scientists
I
is
watched
that
part of that. Yeah, it sounded good. Yeah.
and he's like, guys, if you study only the executive, the legislative, how the judiciary works, and maybe the central bank, you're missing the entire shadow part of which we now know. I mean, the Epsteins and the CIA and all of the shenanigans that are also going on, and all of the money flow and all of the APEC and so on, which obviously then works in tandem with the overt part. The covert part is just part and parcel, and that thing needs some sort of readjustment, and probably readjustment is going to be inevitable because the power base isn't working that way anymore.
This is why I'm a Marxist, because I don't have to reinvent the wheel. The wheel was invented and I'm just using it. But Aaron Good has to reinvent the wheel. You see, that's what Marx knew. There is all the state. Marx talked about the state. That is exactly what he meant. He did not mean the institutional apparatus of government, but the social power, the power in civil society that stands behind the state, that actually, for whom the state is fashioned to work in a certain way, to preserve whose privileges and to advance whose interest the state exists. So that's what the state is, and you always must understand what is the class power behind the state, and of course then how that class's power is created, maintained, etc., which involves all the investments, the flows of money, and so on. But absolutely, and the United States ruling class, it's very interesting. I mean, obviously, it is the monopoly, financialized monopoly corporate capitalist class that we know. But there is also, every so often what happens is this. The state is also a historical entity. It is not static. The state that was created in 1776 is not the same state as it is today, because the nature of class power changes. The foundations of class power change, from farming in Jeffersonian times to manufacturing, and now to finance, and now, of course, to this AI and these technology companies that are really part of the leading edge. And so what happens is that every few decades there is a sort of shift, and we are now looking at, and typically what these shifts involve is waves of deregulation, because the regulation at any given time favors at the old configuration of power.
Right.
When a new capitalist class emerge, they want deregulation so that they can then have the regulations that cement their own power, so that, if after 40 plus years of deregulation, you have this crazy spectacle of a new generation of entrepreneurs, the Mark Zuckerbergs and so on, demanding even more deregulation. It's because they need, they represent a new foundation. Of course, this is a very volatile foundation. You and I were talking about AI and its prospects. I think so much investment is going into AI. Some commentators say that practically the whole of the US economy has now become dependent on AI investment. But there is absolutely no guarantee that this AI investment is actually going to bear fruit in terms of a stable, productive system that is going to yield dividends in terms of jobs, productivity, contribution to GDP, etc. In fact, there is absolutely no guarantee that its promises will be fulfilled. But that's what we are looking at. And Trump, in many ways, has gone over to their side, which is also then undermining his MAGA base, because a lot of his MAGA base are concerned about what these platform companies want to do and
Yeah.
are doing already.
It's quite interesting, a lot of people were expecting that the big AI bubble burst is around the corner, and people have been expecting it. If you look at just the sheer size of the investments that were done, it's like almost insane to believe that all of this will come back through the promises that these companies made. So at some point, this must burst. Or people like make this comparison with the dot-com bubble, right, which eventually burst and left a lot of businesses like bleeding out on the street. But now we actually, before that happens, we have a real economic shock with like a real like oil that's not flowing anymore, which is still the backbone of most countries like productive systems. I mean, Japan, where I am, is like highly worried. I mean, the gasoline prices in the Philippines have already doubled. Unsurprisingly, the more vulnerable countries get hurt first. And still, the AI bubble is also still looming. I mean, we might be in for quite a bit of trouble down the line,
I think
27,
I
28, 29.
Absolutely. I think it could even be this year. I mean, already we are seeing rumbles in the private equity and private credit markets, which are heavily invested in the AI bubble. So I think that that's already like creating that may be the trigger for a larger financial crisis. And the larger financial crisis is also becoming more probable for the following reason. The oil shock that we have suffered, which we already talked about, which is very big. And even if Trump were to declare defeat and stop the war tomorrow, it will take a long time for the oil to come back online. So we are, and maybe not all of it will. So we are in for a big inflationary period coming in. Now, when you have a big inflationary period, but at the same time, economies are slowing down, for reasons again having to do with Trump, his unpredictability, his tariffs, and more generally the ongoing financialization, which does not invest productively but expects to skim off profits that it has not been instrumental in creating. Anyway, the point I'm trying to make is that all of this is creating a stagflationary situation in which the Federal Reserve and other central banks will be caught between, should we raise interest rates in order to quell inflation? But then they should, but they can't, because this will further deepen the recession. So, but either way, I think that, and of course, if they raise interest rates at all, the other thing that will stop them from raising interest rates is that they know that raising interest rates beyond a certain point will prick the bubbles, because all of these bubbles rest on enormous amounts of debt. And the moment that the repayment of that debt becomes more expensive, the money has to be withdrawn. And so all of this is a recipe for the potential for a big financial crash coming very soon.
That might be the straw that will break the camel's neck, but we will see. These economic predictions are notoriously very difficult to make, but at least we want to talk about it.
Exactly. At least point to the possibilities. I mean, I'm not making predictions. I'm saying that the possibility of such a crash is there. Of course, you can never really predict when a crash will occur, because it depends on a whole lot of things coming together. But the things are assembling, let's put it that way.
Yep, they are. Radhika, people who want to find your work, they should first and foremost now go, and now you're free to go and subscribe to Radhika's YouTube channel, Radhika Desai, geopolitical economist. I will also put a link into the description, and we will co-publish this talk here, of course. Is there another place where people should go to find your work?
You can go to radhikadesai.com. And I also have a Substack. I think it's called @RadDesai, so you can go there. And more generally, just look for me. I'm very easy to find.
Everybody look up Radhika Desai. Radhika, thank you for your time today.
Thanks so much, Pascal. Really great to talk to you.